Next up, we have David Gonzalez. David Gonzalez is a doctoral candidate in the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources at Stanford University. He studies environmental health sciences with a focus on reproductive health, health disparities, and exposures to extractive industries. He received his master's in epidemiology from the Stanford School of Medicine, a master's in environmental science from the Yale School of the Environment, and a bachelor's in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of California at Davis. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you, Dr. McKenzie, for queuing us up here. I really appreciate that comprehensive overview. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to present here today. If you hear any barking or howling, it is this guy. So I just want to preface that up front. I'm going to be presenting our study that my colleagues and I published a few months ago. So this is the publication. It is freely available. It's open access if you would like to read the paper yourself. The context, I think, was very well set up by Dr. McKenzie. An estimated over 17.5 million US residents live within a mile of a well, including about 2 million residents in California. As we've just heard, there's substantial evidence of an association between living in proximity to unconventional natural gas wells and adverse birth outcomes. And I think it's important to note a lot of the discussion that we've had so far is focused on unconventional hydraulic fracturing, but conventional drilling, which predominates in California, also produces emissions and exposures that may also confer risk through air pollution and also water contamination, noise pollution, and social disruption. And there's been some work on psychosocial stress and how that affects these birth outcomes. This is what oil and gas looks like in California. This is an image from Google Maps from the sky of Bakersfield. This is in the southern Central Valley where my study was taking place. So here you can see what residential proximity to oil and gas looks like. There's one of the largest oil fields in California here in the east. And then to the west, residential neighborhood, there's churches, elementary schools, people, and obviously many residences. And here from the ground is what it looks like. This is a picture I took in LA showing oil extraction happening in neighborhoods. So for this study, we wanted to look at whether exposure to new wells, so pre-production, and active wells, production wells, during pregnancy was associated with increased risk of preterm birth. We wanted to differentiate those different stages of oil and gas, upstream oil and gas production, because we think, we hypothesize that there may be different emissions, different exposures associated with those different stages. And we also wanted to investigate whether risk varies by gestational age of the infant. So that means, was the infant delivered at 20 to 27 weeks, which would be extremely preterm, 28 to 31 weeks, or 32 to 36 weeks. Many studies treat preterm birth as a sort of a yes or no, like delivery at 37 weeks or fewer. We wanted to, and as Dr. McKenzie indicated, some others have done as well, look at whether there might be differential effects. The reason we did that is because preterm birth is not one outcome. There could be different causes for preterm birth, preterm delivery at different gestational ages. And I forgot to mention this point, the timing of the exposure. So there's evidence from other work that exposure in different trimesters may confer risk. So we wanted to investigate whether exposure in trimester 1, for example, conferred more risk than exposure in other trimesters. So this is our study region, highlighted the outlined 8 counties. So this is the San Joaquin Valley of California. If you can see my mouse, this is San Francisco here in the Northwest. And I've labeled LA here. It's fantastic. And then there's Bakersfield, which is the image I showed you. So what I'm showing here is the area where women who are living in these areas may have been exposed. So you can see where the new wells are located. That's the orange buffer. Purple is active wells, and then the interlap between the two is the red area. And you can see that for the most part, drilling is occurring where we already have active wells. And I think in California, different from many of the other settings we've talked about, some of these wells have been operating for a very long time. In some cases, over 100 years. We have data from the 1800s in our data set from the state. So we use a case control design. So that means that we identified cases of preterm birth. We found controls, so really just comparisons of term births. And we basically get these two groups. And then the idea is to look back retrospectively, so back in time, and see was the group of preterm births more exposed to oil and gas than the controls. And that's a standard epidemiological design to try to look at whether an exposure confers risk. And the data came from the California birth cohort. So we got data on approximately 225,000 live births delivered between 98 and 2011 in these 8 counties in the San Joaquin Valley. And as Dr. McKenzie alluded, all were geocoded at the maternal residence at the time of delivery. And about 12.5% of these were preterm. We got data on oil and gas, the locations of wells, the timing of production, and pre-production from the California Geologic Energy Management Division, CalGEM. There were approximately 83,000 new and active wells during our study period. 97 because some of the births delivered in 98 were exposed in 97 during the pregnancy. So just to show how we're assessing exposure to these births. So here is an example, a cartoon rendition of that neighborhood that we were looking at earlier. Let's say that we have a pregnant woman living in this highlighted house here, and that she has these different wells within a 10-kilometer radius. We did inverse distance weighting within a 10-kilometer for wells within a 10-kilometer radius. Why do we do inverse distance weighting? Well, we think that all these wells may matter, but we think that wells that are closer may matter more, may confer more risk from air pollution, noise, water, all of that. So what we do is we measure the distance between the home and all the wells within that 10-kilometer radius. And then we take this, and then we also need to take the timing into account. So we've measured the distance. We also want to know, were these wells in their pre-production or their production stage during each trimester of the pregnancy? So we know when the birth dates were. We know when we estimate when the date of conception was, so we can get our estimates of when each trimester was. And then we also know when the wells were in their pre-production stage or in their production stage, so we can temporally overlap and just say like, okay, well, well 1 and birth 1 in this data set did overlap in trimester 1. So we will keep that well turned on. We'll calculate all these different matrices, basically what the distance is to each well from each birth. We can look at birth 1 here. It was 2.4 kilometers to well 1. Well 1 was on during that pregnancy. So we do count that well. And we do this for all the wells, for all the births, for all the wells within 10 kilometers of each birth. That allows us to compute this index of exposure. So it's just a number. The number is sort of meaningless because it's like, how do you interpret an inverse distance weighted index? A little bit complicated to interpret because it includes both proximity and density of wells. But our hypothesis is that proximity to oil and gas wells confers risk. If that is true, then we would expect the most exposed births, the births with the highest tercile of exposure, the highest quartile of exposure, to have higher risk of preterm birth than those that do not have any exposure. And that's exactly what we did. So we said, okay, well, we have this index. Let's divide the index into 3 groups. We'll compare the most exposed births with unexposed births. So that's how we get these comparison groups. So it takes more than just having one well 10 kilometers away for you to be considered exposed in this schema. And this is similar to many of the other studies that were mentioned earlier. So results, just to preface this one more time, we looked at preterm birth as 3 different outcomes, essentially: delivery at 20 to 27 weeks, 20 to 31 weeks, and 32 to 36 weeks. And we looked at exposure in each of the 3 different trimesters. So that's what this is going to show you. I know if you attended yesterday, we talked about odds ratios. Odds ratios are a way of representing, interpreting risk. So an odds ratio of 1 means that the exposure has no discernible association with the outcome. Odds ratio greater than 1 means that there is a positive association that, in this case, exposure to wells increases risk. Less than 1, exposure to wells decreases risk of preterm birth. And we're going to show 95% confidence intervals too. We can say it is a statistically significant result if the full 95% confidence interval is on one side of one or the other. And that is what we find. So looking at these births delivered at 20 to 27 weeks, this is a small number of births. Therefore, the confidence intervals are wide. But we observe what appears to be a positive association. So there seems to be potentially increased risk of preterm birth. Delivery at 20 to 27 weeks for that most exposed group compared to the unexposed group. We see a statistically significant result for births at 28 to 31 weeks. With exposure in both trimesters, and you'll note there's no trimester 3 because these births, most of them did not reach trimester 3. For delivery at 32 to 36 weeks, we found no association when we look at the data this way, but I can get into some of the details later. I should also note these models adjust for many other factors that we know are associated with preterm birth, and I should mention that earlier. We're adjusting for the maternal age, we're adjusting for the race and ethnicity, and I'll show a better way to look at the effect of structural racism on birth outcomes in the next slide. We also adjust for whether this is a first birth or the second plus birth, because those factors matter, and the educational attainment of the mother. We found that educational attainment, less than high school, more than high school, very strongly correlated with other measures of individual level socioeconomic status. We did a bunch of other analyses as well, where we looked at what if we account for neighborhood level factors, like neighborhood level things that happen in the neighborhood. I can get more into the details if there's questions about that. That did not substantially change our results. We looked at exposure, let's differentiate exposure to traffic-related air pollutants. Does that change our results? That did not substantially change our impression of the results. But let me get back to, so these other potential explanatory factors don't seem to account for this observed association between exposure to oil and gas wells and preterm birth. So I mentioned earlier looking at structural racism and how that interacts. We know, for example, that Black women have a substantially higher risk of delivering preterm than non-Hispanic white women. So we wanted to look at whether we see whether there are differences when we only consider one racial ethnic group at a time. A difference would suggest that there's some other factors going on, potentially an interaction between structural racism and this risk, and then the exposure. So when we look at the same analysis, and this time we've stratified, or we've broken things up by the maternal race or ethnicity, we find that the risk is confined to and heightened among birth to Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black women. So that's what we're seeing here. So Hispanic would be the red color here, non-Hispanic Black is green, and then non-Hispanic white is blue. So we do not observe the associations for non-Hispanic white women, but we do for non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic. We should note, I think, as was noted yesterday as well, there are disparities in who's exposed. This is a question that we're trying to understand more in some follow-up work that we're doing. Oh, and I should have also mentioned, we also found that risk was confined to women with less than high school education. So risk was heightened among women with lower socioeconomic status and women of color. So we found increased odds of preterm birth with high exposure. We found that the risk was confined and heightened among both Hispanic, non-Hispanic Black women and women with low educational attainment. The results were robust to many sensitivity analyses. So we did a lot of work to try to see if there's something else that explains these results. We couldn't find, we didn't see anything like that. One of the plausible biological mechanisms, and I'm going to talk about this more in the next few slides, is that this effect is mediated by air pollution, but there are other possible explanatory factors. And it could be air pollution, stress, water pollution, or all of them, or some combination of them. Some of the limitations I do want to disclose about our study. We're only able to assess exposure to the maternal residence at time of delivery. The majority of women do not move during their pregnancy, and those that do not move far. But it's possible that we would have misclassified some women as exposed when they were, in fact, not exposed. We assume that proximity confers risk. We have some evidence to support this. And we were unable to count for smoking, but we did a sensitivity analysis among Hispanic women who have a substantially lower rate of smoking than the non-Hispanic women, and we did not observe any differences there. This was a slightly separate analysis than the one I just showed you, but that supports our hypothesis that this is not explained by smoking. In the few minutes I have remaining, I want to spend some time talking about some follow-up work that supports our hypothesis that proximity to wells may confer risk. So in this work, and this is what I'm working on right now, we're trying to understand to what extent do oil and gas pre-production, so new wells and active wells, increase concentrations of air pollutants in California? And how far do air pollutants emitted by new and active wells travel? We are looking at this because as a supplemental analysis in our paper, we assessed exposure to air monitors in California the same way we did for mothers. And we found that for monitors in months with exposed to more wells, higher concentrations of fine particulate matter, PM2.5. That supports our hypothesis and in some sense validates our way of assessing exposure. But we thought that we could do a better job with using the air quality data that we have available in California. So what we did was we took the existing network of in situ monitors, so monitors already in the field, maintained by the EPA and various California agencies. We got 20 years of data, and we basically use a quasi-experimental design where we leverage variations in wind direction to as a source of random variation here. We can't randomly assign monitors to be exposed to oil and gas wells, just as we can't randomly assign births to be exposed. It's not practical, ethical. But we can look at random variations in wind direction and control for things we also know affect air pollution: geography, seasonality, time trends. We use data from 360 air monitors throughout the state. This looks similar. This is very similar to the map I showed you earlier, but now we're looking at air monitors. And then we're assessing exposure a little bit differently. So instead of taking the inverse distance weighting, what we're doing is we draw basically a bunch of donuts around each air monitor for each day. So here's actual data for a monitor, and that will look very familiar. This is a monitor in that neighborhood in Bakersfield I showed you earlier. It's right here where this church is, just west of this church. So this monitor is observing oil and gas wells. This is real data from July 1st, 2009, the midpoint of our data of our data set. These are the wells that were being drilled on that day. So we look at where the wind on that day was coming from the northwest. We look at the wells that were northwest of that monitor. And then we also look at the wells downwind, because we don't think that downwind wells are going to affect pollution. So we fit these. I won't get into the details because this is not the central part of this talk, but basically we're fitting these models, and each monitor is serving as its own control. So we're doing this this quasi-experimental study where monitors serve as their own control, which should account for other sources of pollution at the local level. We find, again, is more robust evidence that PM2.5 concentrations increase with proximity to oil and gas wells. So on the left here, you have, we can see that exposure to one additional well within about 3 kilometers has significantly increases PM2.5 concentrations. At the downwind wells, we didn't see that, just as we expected. They don't seem to affect the concentrations of PM2.5. We saw similar results for sulfur dioxide. And ozone, a bit more complicated, but we did see a signal for more ozone around up to 4 kilometers away. So we found some evidence that drilling activity significantly increased downwind concentrations of PM2.5, SO2, and O3. This may mediate our hypothesized effect of exposure to drilling sites and preterm birth. So we know it's pretty established in literature that PM2.5 exposure increases preterm birth risk. So this is evidence that living near wells does increase that exposure. This work it's work in progress. Happy to talk about it more later and our limitations. But with that, thank you for your attention. Thank you again for inviting me to talk here today. and I'll be happy to take your questions later.